Okay, class, this is the final video for the diction and syntax series. Today we are going to cover the last part of syntax. We're going to specifically focus on antithesis and paradox, because I did leave paradox off of the first diction or the only diction video, but we're going to look at those. We're going to start with juxtaposition and oxymoron, and then that will cover out this series of videos and in preparation for the test that you will have next week. Okay, juxtaposition is the idea of putting two or more ideas, places, characters, and their actions placed side by side for the purpose of developing comparisons and contrasts. The idea that probably just confused you and sounded really weird, but when you're juxtaposing ideas, they're side by side with the intention of making one more obvious, and they're making it the idea of, so like, good versus evil. By putting good versus evil next to each other, you're highlighting the idea of each of them. When you put light versus dark next to each other, one of them stands out with the idea of having the other side there. This also is this idea of balance. Hope versus despair. You got the positive versus the negative. Day versus night fits in with that fits in with that light versus dark. And then the final example here is that idea that winner versus loser. So you have that idea of having both aspects there. Now this example is from a famous novel. I'm not going to tell you where, because I'm probably going to put a question here and a challenge in here on the idea of where does this famous quote come from. So pay attention. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. Now if we look at this, the idea of the juxtaposition, because we're putting two ideas next to each other that are opposites with the idea of highlighting. So just in this first opening sequence, you have the idea of the best and the worst. So you have the opposites to highlight. In the next of them, you have the age of wisdom versus the age of foolishness. In the next one, you have the idea of the epoch of belief and the epoch of incredulity. Incredulity is the lack of belief. Then you have the other one is the season of light and the season of darkness. You have the spring of hope and the winter of despair. And that idea of those opposites of seasons. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. So again, that opposite. And then the last one, we are going direct to heaven, and we are going direct the other way. Now, instead of here saying hell, it emphasizes the idea of the other way because they're actually trying to emphasize this idea of heaven. So this is that idea of juxtaposition, that idea of putting two opposite ideas next to each other to highlight them and show them within that sense. Now juxtaposition also fits into this next idea of an oxymoron, because an oxymoron is a form of juxtaposition. The author on purpose chose to put these two opposite ideas next to or near one another to highlight something. Okay, so this first idea, jumbo shrimp. Shrimp are these tiny little things, but yet if we call it jumbo shrimp's really only a 3 or 4 inch shrimp, but it's that idea that it's a large shrimp. The next one we have is awfully pretty. So when you say that someone's awfully pretty, it kind of sounds like a compliment, but it's not really, because awfully is a bad aspect in the idea of being ugly versus the idea of being pretty. So you're kind of giving them a backhanded compliment where it's not really one. The next one, liquid gas. Liquid and gas do not exist in the same state. So if you say that something is a liquid gas, it is logically incorrect, but in the oxymoron sense, is it that idea that by putting these two next to each other, you're highlighting the idea of either the gas or the liquid itself. Now in this last one, these are in the concept of the near one another. So in order to lead, you must walk behind. So you have this idea of lead and behind. So that is an oxymoron. It's a form of juxtaposition because they're opposite ideas and they're placed near each other. Okay, so it still is an oxymoron. Now the last concept we're going to talk about is this idea of paradox versus antithesis. These are both similar, but what makes them different is how they are actually structured. So a paradox is a statement that appears to contradict itself. Okay, so it's lacking some logic there, and it has that contradiction. Now an antithesis is also this idea of a contradiction and these contrasting ideas, but it's doing it in balanced phrases, and it must use parallelism. So the idea is both of them have the contradiction, but the antithesis has to be a form of parallelism. Okay, let's look at some samples. So this idea, to be or not to be, you have the same structure here with the two be's. So this would be a form of antithesis. I highly suggest that you write these down because these are going to help you with the sense of being able to pick these out, because on the test you're actually going to have a section of sentences where you're going to have to label it as antithesis or paradox. The next one. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. The idea here is you have the can do for you, you have the can do for your country here. So you have the idea of, you also have the yous and the yours. So you have this idea of the balanced or the contradiction and the opposites, but you have the idea that it's still the same grammatical structure. Okay, this one itself is actually a chiasmus. So the idea of the country at the beginning and the country at the end, and chiasmus is a form of parallelism. It is that same structure that goes back and forth. So you have the A plus the B equals the B plus the A. So it fits in there, and this would also be considered an antithesis. This next one, when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, it might have been one small step for a man, but it was one giant leap for mankind. So you have this contradiction in there of that idea of that small versus the giant. Now the small versus the giant is a juxtaposition. It has this idea of this contradiction and this difference, but it's not necessarily in the same grammatical structure. Okay, so because it's not in the same grammatical structure as we saw in the first two examples, we have this idea of this one is actually a paradox. Man and mankind are not the same. You are missing an A here, so it's not the same grammatical structure. And you also have this a different introduction into the phrases themselves. Next one. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Now you know that this came from A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This is that idea of the balancing. So you have that contradiction. You have the same exact it was the. You have the best, you have the worst, you have the contradiction, you have the of times. So this is an antithesis. The next one, the child is father of man. A child cannot be a father of man, so that seems to contradict itself, and you have that opposite in there, and you don't have a grammatical structure. So this would be considered a paradox. High walls make not a palace, full coffers make not a king. The idea of high walls, just because a palace has high walls around it, doesn't make it a palace. And the other side, just because the coffers, meaning the idea of the safe or the vault. So just because they have a lot of money, just because they have a big safe, doesn't make them a king. So that's your idea of the contradiction in there. But looking at the way it's written, the idea of the make not a. So you have that repetition and that parallelism. So that makes this contradiction an antithesis. You are easy on the eyes, but hard on the heart. So looking here at these, you have the easy, you have the hard. You have that idea of on the, and you have on the here as well. But the introduction to this is different with the second phrase. So even though we have part of it being balanced, you don't have the whole thing being balanced because you don't have the idea of the you are connecting both of them the same. So they are not parallel in structure, which would make this a paradox. Okay, and the last one we have here. My advice to you is to never listen to other people's advice. So looking here, we have a contradiction, the idea of I'm giving you advice and I'm telling you never to listen to someone. So you have a contradiction here, but you have no grammatical structure. You have nothing that is even similar to say, I mean, you have some twos in here, but they're not set up to be grammatically correct. So this is considered a paradox. Okay? Have a good night, and I will see you in class tomorrow.